Carl Laemmle Jr. was the son of Carl Laemmle, the founder of Universal Studios. In 1928, on his 21st birthday, he was made the president of Universal. Growing up watching films like The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera, he became a huge horror fan. He loved the concept of monster movies and saw the potential in making more of them under the Universal banner. In 1931, he produced the now legendary Dracula with Bela Lugosi. Then later that year, he followed it up with the also legendary Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff. In 1932, he produced The Mummy, with Boris Karloff in a dual role as Ardith Bey and Imhotep the Mummy. Like many of the Universal monster films, The Mummy had sequel after sequel after sequel. The monster movies kept coming until the release of 1960's The Leech Woman, which is considered the last original Universal monster film. Years later, in the 1970s, a young Stephen Sommers watched many of the Universal monster films. He saw Dracula and Frankenstein, but The Mummy was his favorite. He said it was the only film that ever genuinely scared him. His love of movies led him to enrolling in the USC School of Cinematic Arts, where he earned a master's degree. He wrote and directed a few movies for Disney in the 1990s, and worked as a staff writer for Hollywood Pictures, which was a division of Disney. In the mid-1990s, he wrote a script for a movie called Tentacle, which he later changed to Deep Rising. He pitched the idea to Hollywood Pictures, and they hired him to direct. The film flopped theatrically, opening in 8th place and only pulling in $11 million versus its $45 million budget. This was another film on Roger Ebert's most hated list. He said, "Deep Rising's essentially an Alien clone with a fresh paint job." The movie was a hit on home video and has gone on to become a cult classic. During this time, Universal was looking into resurrecting the Mummy franchise. Originally, they planned on it being a lower-budgeted horror film with Clive Barker directing. Barker had numerous meetings with Universal, but after not being able to come to an agreement, he dropped out. The movie went through various directors after that: Joe Dante, George Romero, Mick Garris, and Wes Craven, but none ever worked out. Stephen Sommers got wind of this and called the producers with his pitch for the film. Rather than it being a straight-up horror film, he saw it as more of a swashbuckling adventure, kind of like an Indiana Jones movie. He was such a huge fan of the 1932 film that he wanted to remake it with a more expansive story and state-of-the-art visual effects which weren't possible back in the day. The studio loved the idea and recognized that this was going to be a gamble, but still increased the budget from $10 million to $80 million. Sommers worked with ILM on Deep Rising, and they enjoyed it so much they happily came back for The Mummy. The studio dedicated $20 million of the budget to go towards the visual effects. They wanted this to be a huge blockbuster with revolutionary visuals that had never been done before. Sommers took elements from previous scripts and wrote his own, which was a sweeping, swashbuckling epic. It had a little bit of everything: adventure, horror, comedy, and romance. In order to get certain aspects of the film correct, they hired Dr. Stuart Smith, an Egyptologist. He also worked with Roland Emmerich for the Egyptian segments of Stargate. He took the lines spoken by Imhotep in the script and translated them to be as close to ancient Egyptian as possible. He then spoke the words phonetically and recorded them for the actors to use to learn their lines. ILM took some of the concepts Sommers came up with and returned with even more elaborate visuals they could produce. While ILM worked on the visuals, they started casting. There was a rumor Leonardo DiCaprio was offered the lead but turned it down due to a scheduling conflict with The Beach. After that, everyone from Brad Pitt to Matt Damon to Ben Affleck and even Tom Cruise was considered for the part, but the role ended up going to Brendan Fraser. Fraser had just come off the surprise hit George of the Jungle, and Sommers thought he had the right amount of charm and charisma needed for the lead. Rachel Weisz was the only actress considered for the role of Evelyn. Thankfully, she accepted. Oded Fehr was hired to play the lead protector of Imhotep's tomb. In an homage to the original, they named him Ardith Bey. Originally, his face was supposed to be covered with tattoos, but Sommers thought that he was entirely too handsome to do that, so he settled on 2 small tattoos. Arnold Vosloo was hired to play Imhotep the Mummy. He liked the ideas behind the film and relished being able to play such an elaborate villain. Sommers worked with Kevin J. O'Connor on Deep Rising and liked him so much, he brought him back for The Mummy. ILM had been working for months designing everything from ancient Egypt to the catacombs to the look of the mummy and his minions. Sommers wanted the Mummy to look like nothing we had ever seen before. He wanted him as a fully 3D character with holes in his body so we'd be able to see through him. Sommers wanted to keep the look of Imhotep scary, but not gross. They had dozens of designs until finally combining some of them to come up with one the director was happy with. Filming started in May of 1998. Due to dangerous political conditions, they couldn't shoot in Egypt, so a large portion was filmed in Marrakesh, Morocco. The desert scenes were shot in the Sahara, and many of the interiors, like the catacombs, were on sound stages in Shepperton Studios in England. Many of the scenes with huge backdrops were matte paintings. The city in the opening was built inside a 400-year-old Portuguese fort. They had full-scale pillars built on location, and miniatures they used for the destruction. The opening shot was in development for 2 years. They drew it up as concept art, then designed the layout in the computer. Once they had the design, they shot a live-action plate to match up with the CG. Finally, they composited it all together. The hanging scene was the first thing they shot. Brendan Fraser wanted it to look realistic, so he told the stunt coordinators to make the noose tight. Unfortunately, they made it too tight, and he blacked out. They panicked and revived him after they realized he wasn't acting. Filming in the desert was rough. It reached a temperature of 130 degrees during the day. Sommers said that while this was uncomfortable, the temperature made the cast and crew work harder. They really wrapped Arnold Vosloo in bandages for his mummification scene. It took 4 hours. The scarabs dumped on him were CG, although they had a few plastic ones in the bucket so the actor had something to react to. Patricia Velasquez played Anak Sunamun. Originally another actress was hired for the part, but dropped out, leaving them a few days to find a replacement before filming. Aside from some strategically placed jewelry, she was completely naked and covered in body paint. For the scene in the library, they had a male stuntman wearing Rachel Weisz's clothes. The bookshelf dominoes sequence was shot in 1 take. Dr. Smith suggested the mirror lights, which was based off an actual design the Egyptians used. They reused the scene where we first see Ardith Bay, once during the day, and then the same scene as day for night. The cliff they were on was only a few feet high. The sand waves were practical. They had a device under the sand to move it around. ILM then added the face in later digitally. The first time we see the mummy, it's a prosthetic, but later it's fully CG. The locust swarm was CG, with the exception of these ones sitting on Dr. Chamberlain. They put live locusts in a refrigerator for a little while to make them docile, then dumped a bucket full of them on the actor. When Rick and Benny are yelling at each other, the director told them to act like 2 12-year-olds.
Hey! O'Connell! It looks to me like I've got all the horses!
Hey, Benny! Looks to me like you're on the wrong side of the river!
The mummy was CG, and Vosloo did the motion capture work. For his scenes, he did the scene with the actor or actress. Then they did the scene again without him there, and the actor reacted to no one. For certain scenes, they put tracking lights on him as reference points for ILM to add in digital effects. Vosloo laughed and said he had so many lights on him he felt like a Christmas tree. The big fight scene at the end with Rick versus the priests was an homage to Ray Harryhausen, specifically the skeleton fight in Jason and the Argonauts. Fraser trained with the stunt coordinators and orchestrated the whole scene. He filmed it with the stuntmen, and then again by himself so the priests could all be added in later digitally. For the face in the sandstorm, they took a scan of Arnold Vosloo's face and put it in the computer. The scene where the mummy steals the eyes of one of the archaeologists initially had more meaning to it. The guy loses his glasses and can barely see. When Imhotep steals his eyes, he also has bad vision, which is why he mistakes Evelyn for Anak Sunamun. They cut this part out, and now he just thinks it's her for no reason. The movie had about 160 visual effects shots, costing an average of about $125,000 per shot. Filming finally ended in August of 1998. ILM continued to tweak the visual effects while the film was edited and scored. Sommers worked hard to keep the balance of horror and comedy. He had to cut out a few comedic lines because even though the joke worked, it undermined the scariness of the scene. While editing the film, there was a scene where Imhotep appears, drains the life out of one of the Americans, a scarab crawls out of his neck, and he chews it. The scene took days to do because the actors had to hit their marks in this very complex scene. The visual effects weren't done at this point, so the executives were seeing this with just Vosloo and the markers. Even after explaining it to them, they wanted to cut the scene. Why is this in here? Nothing's happening. It's slow. Sommers fought for 7 months to keep the scene while ILM finished the effects. Once they saw the completed version, they finally understood and agreed to leave it in the film. The scene would go on to be one of the most memorable and talked about moments in the movie. The visual effects work was incredibly complicated, and they worked up to the last minute. The visuals weren't finished until 8 days before the premiere. Everyone involved was excited for the premiere until the film started rolling. The film snapped 3 times during the screening, causing some of them to think the movie was cursed. The wide opening went much better. The film opened on May 7th, 1999 in first place and was a smash hit with $43 million. The movie pulled in almost $416 million worldwide and was the 6th highest grossing film of the year. Audiences loved the movie, but critics weren't too impressed. Roger Ebert gave it 3 out of 4 stars, but still gave it backhanded compliments. There's hardly a thing I can say in its favor, except that I was cheered by nearly every minute of it. I cannot argue for the script, the direction, the acting, or even the mummy, but I can say that I was not bored and sometimes unreasonably pleased. It's almost like he didn't want to just admit that he liked it. The day after it opened, the studio called Sommers and said, "We need another one!" Sommers was more than happy to do a sequel, as was everyone else. The cast, crew, and ILM all enjoyed working on The Mummy so much, they all came back for the sequel, The Mummy Returns, which was another massive hit. Sommers didn't return to direct the third film, and while it did break over $400 million worldwide, it also cost nearly double what the original did, and wasn't as well received by audiences. Wanting to do something different, Sommers took on some of the other Universal monsters, and wrote and directed Van Helsing. Unfortunately, this didn't go over as well as the two Mummy movies, and with Part 3 underperforming, the franchises were shelved. In 2010, Universal tried to rekindle interest in their monsters with The WOLFMAN, which was a remake of the film from 1941. It failed, making only $139 million versus its $150 million budget. In 2014, they tried again with Dracula Untold. This was to be the beginning of the Universal Monster shared universe. It did okay, making $217 million versus its $70 million budget, but it wasn't the hit they had hoped for. Plus, audiences and critics weren't too kind on the film. Now they're going for broke, with Tom Cruise to star in the reboot and hopeful beginning of the Universal Monsters universe with The Mummy, although now they're calling it the Dark Universe. With a $125 million budget and a huge marketing campaign, they're hoping that the third time's a charm. The Mummy is a wonderful action adventure. It's got some spectacular scenes, groundbreaking effects, and genuinely funny humor. While some of the CG is dated now, there's still a few moments that put today's CG to shame. For better or worse, they pushed the technology as far as they could back then, and showed the world computer effects opened up unlimited possibilities for filmmakers. They were pushing the visuals as hard as they could at the time, creating new and spectacular sights. The CG in the '99 Mummy still holds up well because they had years to design and implement the effects. With all the advances in technology, the new Mummy seems to be borrowing moments from the '99 version, like the face in the sand wall. Regardless of the outcome of the new Mummy film, the franchise has proven to be one that simply will not die.
Well, if it ain't my little buddy Benny, I think I'll kill you.
Think of my children.
You don't have any children.
Someday I might.
Shut up.